The portrait had hung above the fireplace for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days, and every soul in Redemption Creek, Texas knew better than to mention it to Luke Wells. It was the year 1873, and the land in the Texas Hill Country was as unforgiving as it was beautiful, all limestone cliffs and cedar breaks, where the summer heat pressed down on a man's shoulders like a physical weight, and the winters came sudden and mean from the north. Luke's ranch, the Double W, sat on 400 acres of the finest grazing land between San Antonio and the Pedernales River, and he had built every fence post, every barn beam, every stone wall of the main house with his own 2 hands and the hands of his late wife, Clara. Clara Wells had been 26 years old when the fever took her, leaving Luke at 31 with a working cattle ranch, 800 head of longhorn, 2 Mexican ranch hands named Ernesto and Pablo, and a silence in the house so complete that it rang in his ears on quiet evenings like a bell that would not stop. He had not known before her death that a house could be loud from silence. He knew it now. The portrait had been painted by a traveling artist who came through Redemption Creek in the spring of 1869, the year Luke and Clara had been married. The artist was a slight man from Philadelphia who painted with an economy of brushstrokes that somehow captured more truth than a photograph, and Clara had sat for him on the porch steps in her blue Sunday dress, her dark hair pinned back but one curl escaping to rest against her cheek, and she had been laughing at something Luke said off to the side when the artist caught her expression, and that was the face preserved in oils above the fireplace. Laughing. Alive. Her brown eyes warm and full of a joke. Luke could not bring himself to take it down. He told himself it was because she deserved to remain in her own home. He told himself it was because the wall behind it had a water stain he had not gotten around to fixing. He told himself many things on many evenings while he sat in the wooden chair across from the fire with a glass of whiskey growing warm in his hand, talking to the portrait sometimes without meaning to, catching himself mid-sentence and feeling the foolishness settle over him like a coat that did not fit. Ernesto had suggested, gently and only once, that perhaps the señor might feel better if the portrait was moved to the bedroom. Luke had looked at him for a long moment and then said, quietly, that Ernesto should go check the south fence line and not mention it again. Ernesto had gone without another word, because he was a wise man who understood grief the way men who have known their own grief understand it, and he had not mentioned it again. Pablo, who was younger than Ernesto by a decade and more given to speaking his mind, said nothing at all on the subject, which showed he was smarter than most people gave him credit for. The town of Redemption Creek had a population of 314 souls, according to the census that had been taken the previous spring, and nearly all of them knew Luke Wells by sight if not by name, and all of them who knew him by name knew about the portrait and gave him a wide berth when it came to the subject of his feelings. He came to town twice a month for supplies, spoke to the necessary people, conducted his business at the general store and occasionally at the bank, drank 1 beer at the saloon on Saturday evenings while exchanging weather opinions with the ranchers who gathered there, and then drove his wagon back out to the Double W and resumed his solitude. He was not an unkind man. He was not a cold man. He was simply a man who had put everything he had into one place and then watched that place disappear, and had not yet worked out what came next. That was the state of things on the morning of October the 3rd, 1873, when Matilda Thatcher walked onto his land. She came from the east on foot, which was the first remarkable thing about her. The second remarkable thing was that she was walking as though she had a destination and intended to reach it, despite the fact that her dress was torn at the hem, and her boots were caked with red clay mud, and she was carrying a carpet-bag that appeared to be held together by determination alone, the brass clasp broken, and the leather strap mended with what looked like a piece of bridle cord. The third remarkable thing, which Luke would not identify as remarkable until much later, was that she did not look afraid. Luke saw her from the corral, where he was working with a bay mare he had acquired at the Kerrville Horse Fair the previous month. The mare was not yet convinced that Luke was trustworthy, which Luke considered a reasonable position, given that horses were often better judges of character than people gave them credit for. He had been making slow, patient circles around her for the better part of an hour when the movement at the far end of the drive caught his eye. He watched her come. She was still a good quarter-mile away, but her pace did not slow, and she was walking straight up the center of the road between his fence lines as though she had been invited. He tied the mare to the fence post and set his hat back on his head and waited. She stopped about 20 feet from him, and in the morning light he could see her more clearly. She was perhaps 24 or 25, with hair the color of autumn wheat that had come partly loose from its pins, and was doing as it pleased in the October breeze. She had green eyes that were sharp and direct, and a face that was tanned from outdoor weather rather than sheltered from it. There was a bruise along her left jaw that was 2 or 3 days old, faded to yellow-green at the edges, and her expression, when she looked at him, was careful in the way that someone who has learned caution is careful. "I am looking for the Double W Ranch," she said. Her voice was steady and clear with a faint East Texas accent, the vowels a little longer than a hill country person would make them. "You found it," Luke said. "Then you are Luke Wells." "I am." She set the carpetbag down in the road dust and straightened her spine and looked at him directly. "My name is Matilda Thatcher. I have been traveling for 4 days and I have 14 cents to my name, and I am not going to pretend that my situation is anything other than desperate, because I expect you can see that it is. I am looking for work. I can cook. I can keep a house. I can do laundry. I can tend a kitchen garden, and I can do basic doctoring for animals if needed. I am not asking for charity. I am asking for honest work at an honest wage, and I will earn what I am paid." Luke looked at her for a long moment. The morning sun was behind her, and it turned the loose pieces of her hair to something close to gold. The bay mare in the corral behind him had gone still and was watching the stranger with pricked ears, which was generally a sign that a horse considered someone more interesting than threatening. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "Brenham," she said, and something moved briefly in her expression, quick as a shadow crossing ground before the careful look settled back. "I had a situation there that I needed to leave behind." "Relation to Thatcher over at the mill in Brenham, Jonas Thatcher." A pause that told him the answer before she spoke it. "He is my father." Luke had met Jonas Thatcher twice at cattle association meetings, and both times had come away thinking that the man smiled too easily and meant too little of it. The bruise on her jaw was a day or 2 old, and Brenham was 4 hard days' walk from Redemption Creek. He did not press her on the details, because a man who has had his own privacy respected learns to respect other people's. "I don't have a housekeeper," Luke said. "I can see the place could use one," she said, not unkindly, glancing at the house beyond the corral, and the bluntness of it surprised a short sound from him that was not quite a laugh. "What I mean," he said, "is that the position is open. I haven't had one since he stopped. In a while, I can offer room and board and $6 a month. The work is hard. I have 2 ranch hands, Ernesto and Pablo, who eat supper in the main house. If that arrangement doesn't suit you, I understand." She picked up her carpetbag without hesitation. "It suits me fine." And that was how Matilda Thatcher came to the Double W. The spare bedroom was small and faced east, so it caught the morning light first, and it had a window that stuck in the frame and required a firm jolt with the heel of the hand to open, which Luke apologized for, and she dismissed with a gesture that said clearly she had dealt with worse. He showed her the kitchen, which was a large room at the back of the house with a good iron stove and a deep stone sink and a pump that worked if you primed it first. She stood in the doorway and looked at it with the expression of someone assessing a problem they know how to solve, and then she asked where he kept his cornmeal and his flour, and he showed her. And by noon there was bread rising on the counter, and the smell of it moved through the house like something that had been waiting to return. That evening, when she brought supper to the table, Ernesto looked at the plate in front of him, and then up at Luke with an expression of barely suppressed emotion. Pablo simply said, "Thank God," with such feeling that Matilda laughed, and the sound of a woman's laugh in that kitchen made Luke look up from his plate, and for a single unguarded moment the grief hit him so squarely that he had to look back down quickly and wait for it to pass. She did not see it, or if she saw it, she understood well enough to let it alone. Over the following week, Matilda established herself in the Double W with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to making a home in difficult circumstances. She learned where things were kept, reorganized the larder, repaired the kitchen curtains that had been hanging half off their rod for what appeared to be the better part of a year, and made it clear to both Ernesto and Pablo that she was glad of their company but did not require their help in the kitchen. Ernesto, who had a wife and 3 children in Careville, and came back to them on his days off, treated her with a respectful formality that softened gradually into something more like warmth. Pablo, who was 22 and good-natured in the way of young men who have not yet had enough disappointments to make them otherwise, was inclined to be cheerful at her, and she received it with good humor. Luke she saw at meals and occasionally around the property when their work brought them near the same area. He was a quiet man, not unfriendly, but contained in a way that was different from shyness. It was more like a man who had drawn a careful boundary around himself and was polite to anyone who came near it, but did not open the gate. She noticed the portrait on her first evening, when she had come out to the main room after supper to find out where he kept the lamp oil. It stopped her where she stood, not because she had not known he was a widower, as that had been the talk among the women at the trading post in the last town she had passed through, but because of the woman in it. She was beautiful, but it was not that. It was the expression, the absolute aliveness of it, and the way it sat above the cold hearth as though it were still the center of the room, as though the woman had simply stepped out for a moment and would be back directly. Luke was sitting in the chair across from it with a book open in his lap that she suspected he had not been reading. "She was lovely," Matilda said quietly. He looked up at her, and the expression on his face was so briefly, nakedly unguarded that she immediately looked back at the portrait to give him a moment. "Yes," he said, "she was." "I am sorry for your loss," she said, which she meant fully and without embellishment, and then she asked about the lamp oil, and he told her, and that was all that was said about it. But she thought about the portrait later, lying in the small east bedroom with the October wind coming through the gap she had left in the stuck window. She thought about a man who had kept a woman's laughing face above his fireplace for more than 3 years because he could not yet say goodbye, and she thought about grief, which she knew something about herself, having lost her mother at 16, and then spent the years since watching her father make a slow disaster of everything her mother had loved and built. She did not pity Luke Wells. Pity was a soft and useless thing, in her experience. But she understood him a little, she thought, in the way that people who have carried weight understand something about the posture of other people carrying weight. The first real conversation between them came about on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after her arrival, when the weather turned cold fast, and the kitchen garden she had been quietly restoring behind the house needed covering before the frost came. She was out in the fading afternoon wrestling with a length of burlap that was determined not to cooperate with the wind, and Luke appeared at the corner of the house, and without asking or commenting, took the other end of the burlap and held it steady while she drove the stakes. They worked in silence for a while, which was comfortable rather than awkward, and when they were done and she stood brushing the dirt from her hands, she looked at the garden and said, "There's good soil here. Whoever planted this last knew what they were doing." "Clara," he said, and then he added, as though he had not meant to but was continuing now that he had started, "She used to be out here every morning in the spring. Said the garden was the best part of the day." "My mother was the same way," Matilda said. "She had roses. Even in East Texas she kept them alive. People thought it was impossible, and she just thought they needed more attention than other things." Luke looked at the garden and then at her. "Where is your mother now? She died 8 years ago. Typhoid. He nodded, the small nod of a man who understands loss as a specific and concrete thing rather than an abstraction. I'm sorry. She was a fine woman, Matilda said, finer than most people knew. They walked back toward the house in the early dusk, and he held the back door open for her without thinking about it. And she noticed that it was the first unconscious courtesy he had shown her, the first thing he had done without deliberating over it, and she recognized it for what it was. A small door opening, just a crack. October moved into November with the slow drama of a hill country autumn, the cedar turning deeper green while the live oaks held their bronze leaves, and the sky went that particular hard blue that belongs only to that part of Texas in that season. The work of the ranch shaped the days into a reliable rhythm. Early rising, the breakfast fire, meals 3 times daily, the laundry twice weekly, the endless small repairs and improvements that a house required. Matilda also began keeping a more organized account of the household supplies, noting what ran low and what needed ordering before the next trip to town. And one evening she presented Luke with a list that was so precisely organized he looked at it for a moment before saying, "I've been running out of coffee at least twice a month for 3 years." "I can see that from the purchases in the account book," she said. "You buy the same amount every time regardless of how much you've been through." "I don't usually pay that much attention," he admitted. "I do," she said simply and went back to her mending. He sat looking at the list for another minute, and then he looked up at her, bent over her work by the lamp, and something moved through him that he could not quite name and did not examine too closely. The trouble with her father arrived on a Thursday in the second week of November. Luke had driven to town for supplies and left her and the ranch hands to their work, and he had been gone perhaps 3 hours when a man rode up the drive on a horse that was too good for his evident character. A broad-faced man in his 50s, with a merchant's coat, and a self-importance set to his shoulders that Matilda recognized from 20 years of living under the same roof with him. She came out of the house and stood on the porch and watched him come, and her face did what it did, the careful, contained look that was armor. "Matilda," Jonas Thatcher said, pulling his horse to a stop at the fence. "Father," she said, "I've come to take you home." He said it as though there were no other possible arrangement of the universe, as though the 4 days of walking and the broken carpetbag and the bruise on her jaw had simply been a minor misunderstanding. "I am not coming home," she said. "I have work here. I am earning my own way." "This is not respectable," he said, and his voice had that edge in it that she knew, the one that preceded certain kinds of escalation. "A woman working alone on a cattle ranch. Do you know what people are saying? People in Brenham can say what they like. I am in Redemption Creek now." Ernesto had appeared from the direction of the barn with the particular quality of presence that a large, calm man has when he has decided to be a witness to something. He leaned against the fence post 20 yards away and did not say anything and did not look directly at the scene, but he also did not leave. Jonas Thatcher looked at Ernesto and then back at his daughter, and the self-important set of his shoulders shifted slightly. "You will come home," he said. "You have obligations." "My obligations to you are discharged," Matilda said, and her voice was as level as a carpenter's spirit line. "I kept your house for 8 years after Mother died. I cooked your meals and washed your clothes and kept your books and endured what I endured, and I am done. I am 25 years old and I have the right to make my own way. You are my daughter. I am a woman grown and I am telling you plainly that I will not come back. You should go, Father. This is private property." He looked at her for a long moment with the calculation that she knew well, measuring whether a scene would serve him, and deciding against it when Ernesto shifted his position slightly, and Pablo materialized from the other direction with a bucket he was carrying to somewhere unspecified and not particularly convincingly. Jonas Thatcher was many things, but he was not a man who fought at unfavorable odds. "This is not finished," he said. "For me it is," she said. He turned his horse and rode back down the drive, and she stood on the porch and watched him go until he was through the gate and onto the public road, and then she sat down on the porch step and let out a breath she felt she had been holding for about 8 years. Ernesto walked over and sat down on the fence rail at a respectful distance. "He will come back?" he asked. "Probably not," she said. "He does not like to lose, but he likes to be comfortable more than he likes to win. And I think he has already started looking for someone else to run his house." Ernesto nodded as though this made sense. "My mother had a father like that," he said. "She walked away from him with nothing and made herself a whole life." Matilda looked at him. "Did she?" "She did," he said. "It was not easy, but it was hers." When Luke came back that evening and was told by Pablo what had happened, he found Matilda in the kitchen and stood in the doorway for a moment before she turned from the stove. She read something in his expression, the careful concern of a man who is not sure of his footing. "I should have asked you before now," he said. "You left something behind you in Brenham. I can see that. I want you to know that you don't owe me an explanation for it, but I also want you to know that if there is trouble that follows you here, I would rather know about it and be prepared than be surprised." She looked at him steadily. "My father is a difficult man. He is not violent exactly, but he uses what he has to get what he wants, and what he had for a long time was a daughter who had nowhere else to go. I left because I found the courage to leave, and because he struck me once about 3 weeks ago when I refused to agree with something he wanted, and I decided that would be the last time." She said it matter-of-factly with the careful dignity of someone who refuses to dramatize their own suffering. "He came today to take me back and I sent him away. I do not believe he will come again, but I thought you should know the full picture." Luke's jaw had tightened during her account and he was quiet for a moment. "You should have said so at the start," he said. "I didn't know you at the start," she said. "I knew you well enough to ask for work. I didn't know you well enough to trust you with my whole situation." He considered that. "That's fair," he said. "But I know you better now," she said, and went back to the stove, and he stood in the doorway for a moment longer before he went to wash up for supper. That night, alone in the main room after the house had gone quiet, Luke looked at the portrait above the fireplace for a long time. He picked up his glass and then set it down without drinking, and he said quietly to the painted woman with the warm, laughing eyes, "She's something, Clara. She really is." The portrait did not answer him, because it was a painting. But the fire popped once, as fires will, and the warmth of it moved through the room, and he sat for a while in something that was not quite peace, but was closer to it than he had been in a long time. November deepened, and with it the friendship between them, which was the accurate word for what was building, though neither of them was examining it closely enough to name it. They were together for parts of each day, as the household required, but beyond the necessary, they were also beginning to find themselves in the same places without strictly needing to be. She started bringing 2 cups of coffee out to the porch on cold mornings rather than one, and leaving one on the rail for him without comment, and he started finding reasons to finish the early morning work near enough to the house that he could come in when she called breakfast without the walk being too long. And none of this was discussed or planned. It simply happened, the way certain things happen between 2 people who are circling something neither of them has quite admitted to yet. One evening after supper, when Ernesto and Pablo had gone back to the bunkhouse and the dishes were done, she found a chessboard in the bottom of the chest in the main room while looking for an extra blanket. She held it up and looked at him with a question. "Clara's," he said. "She tried to teach me 3 separate times. Did you learn?" "I am a poor student," he said, with the rueful self-knowledge of a man who is generally good at things and finds this particular gap in his abilities mildly amusing. "I play well," she said. "My mother taught me." "Is that so? Sit down," she said. "I'll teach you properly this time." He sat across the table from her, and she set out the pieces with the quick, practiced movements of someone who loves the game, explaining each piece and its possibilities, and Luke paid attention with the focused quality of a man who takes most things seriously. And the evening went by in a way that evenings in that house had not gone for a very long time. With the lamp between them and the fire on one side, and the moves and countermoves and her voice explaining the theory of it and his voice asking questions, and then the occasional silence when they were both looking at the board, He lost badly and cheerfully, which surprised her slightly. She had expected him to be frustrated by losing, but he simply looked at the board after the game and said, "I see 3 things I could have done differently." And she said, "4, but start with the 3 you saw." And he laughed, which surprised them both. His laugh was low and genuine, and it changed his whole face, the weight it usually carried lifting for a moment, and she looked at him in the lamplight and felt something turn in her chest like a key in a lock. She looked back at the chessboard and began resetting the pieces with great concentration. "Again?" she asked. "Again," he said. December came in with a blue norther that dropped the temperature 40 degrees in an afternoon and left ice in the water trough by morning. Luke spent 3 hard days in the cold getting the cattle into the lower pastures where there was shelter and checking the fence lines in the wind, and Matilda made sure there was hot food at the end of each day, and that the fire in the main room was kept going. And on the 3rd evening, when he came in from the last fence check with his hands so cold he could barely work the buckles on his coat, she said nothing, but simply brought a basin of warm water and set it on the table in front of him. "That's not necessary," he said. "Your hands are going to crack and bleed if you don't warm them properly," she said, and the practicality of it was so matter-of-fact that he could not frame an argument. So he put his hands in the warm water and sat there while the feeling came back into his fingers, which was initially painful and then not. And she sat across from him with her mending, and they talked about what fence line had been worst, and what she had made with the venison Ernesto had brought by yesterday, and what they needed from the mercantile before Christmas. It was the most domestic scene he had sat in the middle of in 3 years, and it felt like something he had forgotten how to want and was only now remembering. "Matilda," he said. She said, not looking up from her mending. He did not know what he had meant to say. The words had arrived at the gate of his mouth without clear credentials, and he found he could not make them cohere. "Nothing," he said, tired. She looked up at him then, and he thought that those green eyes were too sharp not to have seen something, but she just said, "Then go to sleep," kindly, and looked back at her mending. He went to his room and lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and tried to understand what was happening to him. And after a while, he decided that what was happening was that he was alive, still, in ways he had half forgotten, and that this was a complicated thing to discover. Christmas in Redemption Creek was a modest affair. The church service on Christmas morning and a community meal at the Grange Hall afterward, and a few store-bought goods exchanged among those who could afford them. Luke drove the wagon to town with Matilda beside him on the seat and Ernesto and Pablo in the back, and all 4 of them went to the service, and Matilda sang the hymns from memory in a clear, unself-conscious alto that Luke stood next to, and felt move through him in a way he had not expected. After the community meal, they drove home in the early winter dark, and the stars over the hill country were the winter stars, brilliant and hard and innumerable, and she sat beside him on the wagon seat with her coat pulled close and her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and she looked up at the sky and said, "I have never been anywhere that had so many stars." "Big sky out here," he said. "Is that why you came here, to build here?" "My father ranched in central Texas. I grew up knowing this kind of country. Clara and I chose this specific place because we stood on that hill behind the house the first time we walked the land, and we could see 40 miles in every direction." And she said, "This is it." He paused. She was right. Matilda was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like she was a decisive woman." "The most decisive person I have ever known," he said, and there was something warm in the way he said it, the grief that was always there, but gentled now by time into something more like gratitude. She never wasted time on doubt. Matilda looked at the stars. "I admire that. I have spent a good deal of time in my life doubting myself. I am trying to be done with it." "You don't seem like someone who doubts herself," he said, and he meant it genuinely. She turned to look at him in the dark, and the starlight caught the side of her face, and she said, "Thank you for that. You might be the first person who has ever said so." He kept his eyes on the road ahead because the gelding needed watching on the frozen ruts, but he was very aware of her beside him, the 6 inches of cold air between them on the wagon seat, and the strange gravity of the moment. He had given her a Christmas gift that morning quietly before they left for town. A pair of good leather gloves from the Mercantile in Careville, ordered specifically because her hands were always cold when she came in from the kitchen garden. She had held them and looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read, and then she had said thank you in a voice that was quieter than usual. She had given him a book on animal husbandry that she had ordered through the Mercantile 3 weeks ago, understanding somehow that he would value a practical thing, and he had looked at it and then at her and said, "How did you know I wanted this?" And she had smiled and said, "You mentioned the goodnight ranching methods twice in a week, and there was nothing about them in your library." He had gone to bed on Christmas Eve thinking about the fact that she had been paying attention. January came with more cold and the long work of winter ranching, the feeding and tending, and the constant vigilance against the weather that dropped on the land without warning. There was a hard ice storm in the second week of January that kept them all in the house for 2 days, and in the afternoon of the second day, with the sleet striking the windows and the fire roaring in the hearth, Matilda taught Luke to play chess properly enough that he began to give her a real game, and they sat across from each other for 3 hours with the wind howling outside and the house warm and close around them. And at one point she made a move that surprised him enough that he looked up at her with genuine admiration in his expression and said, "That was ruthless." And she said, not hiding her pleasure in it, "Thank you very much," and they grinned at each other across the board. Like two people who have forgotten, for the length of that moment, that there is any constraint between them. He reached across the board to move a piece, and his hand brushed her hand where it rested on the edge of the table, and neither of them moved for the space of 2 heartbeats, and then he moved his piece and she considered the new position with great attention, and neither of them mentioned it. But something had shifted. Something had moved, like a door in a room you did not know was unlocked. It was Pablo who precipitated the crisis, though through no fault of his own. In the last week of January, Pablo took a fall from a horse he was breaking, a bad fall onto frozen ground that left him with a fractured wrist and a cracked rib, and enough pain that he could do nothing useful for 3 weeks at minimum. Luke and Ernesto took on the extra work between them, which meant longer days and more exhaustion, and Matilda found ways to ease the load where she could, bringing meals out to the men instead of calling them in, and checking on Pablo in the bunkhouse to change his bandages and make sure he was not running a fever from the rib. She was coming back from the bunkhouse late one afternoon when she found Luke at the fence line behind the barn, mending a section that had given way under an ice-weighted branch. He was working fast in the fading light, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that he was past tired, and into something more like the exhaustion that makes a man work harder because the alternative is to stop and feel how bad it is. She took the other end of the wire without asking and held it while he worked the pliers, and they fixed the fence in the gray winter light without talking, and when it was done he straightened and looked at her and his face was open with the tiredness, unguarded in the way that very tired people become. "You didn't need to," he said. "2 pairs of hands go faster," she said. He looked at her for a moment and then he said, "Matilda," and this time the words were there. "I don't know how to say this in a way that doesn't sound," he stopped, rubbing the back of his neck in a gesture she recognized as his specific form of self-consciousness. "I want you to know that I am grateful you are here. Not for the work, though the work matters, but for," he gestured a little helplessly toward the house and the land and everything it contained, "for making this place feel like a house again instead of just a building I live in." She was quiet for a moment, holding the silence carefully the way you hold something that might break if gripped too hard. The gray sky was turning lavender at the edges and the cedar smell was strong in the cold air. "I am glad to be here," she said, and meant every syllable of it. "It is the first place in years that I have felt," she searched for the word. "Safe," she said finally, "and useful both at once. That is not a small thing." He looked at her with that open, unguarded face that the tiredness had given him, and she could see so clearly in that moment the man inside the grief and the careful manners, the man who had loved his wife enormously and lost her, and did not know yet that love could come again if he opened his hands and let it. She looked away at the fence line before she gave herself away entirely. "Come in and eat," she said. "You need to sit down." He did, and they sat at the table, and Ernesto sat with them because Pablo was eating in the bunkhouse, and they were three at a table designed for six, and she put venison stew on the table and bread she had made that morning, and they ate in the easy quiet that had grown up between all of them over the past months. And after, Ernesto said good night and went to the bunkhouse, and she and Luke sat on opposite sides of the fire with coffee in their hands and the night outside pressing at the windows. "Tell me about your mother," he said, which surprised her, because the question was a personal one and he had been careful with personal questions until now. She told him about her mother, Margaret Thatcher, who had grown up in Louisiana and come to East Texas with a man she loved and built a life there with skill and humor, and the particular fierce optimism of a woman who refuses to be defeated by circumstances. She told him about the roses and about Margaret's kitchen, where everything always smelled of something good, and about the laugh she had, too big for a small woman, the kind of laugh that people 3 rooms away smiled at without knowing why. She talked for a long time, longer than she had talked about her mother to anyone since her mother died, and when she stopped she realized that her coffee was cold and that Luke was watching her with an expression she did not see on his face very often, which was the expression of someone who is fully, entirely present. "She sounds extraordinary," he said. "She was," Matilda said. "And I look like her, which sometimes makes me feel like I am carrying her with me wherever I go, which I don't mind." Luke looked toward the fireplace and the portrait above it, and she watched him look at it, and she saw what was in his face, the love and the loss and the long 3 years of keeping faith with a woman who was gone, and she felt a tenderness so fierce it frightened her slightly. "I think," he said slowly, "that the people we love most become part of what we are, so in a way, yes, you are carrying her. And you are carrying Clara," she said gently. He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "I am." He looked at the portrait. "I have been afraid, I think, that letting go of the weight of it would be," he stopped, "that it would mean something, about how much I loved her." Matilda was careful. "What do you think it would mean?" "That I was moving on," he said, "that she could be set aside." "Do you really think love works like that?" she asked. "That if you stop carrying the grief, you lose the love with it?" He looked at her. The fire was burning low and the room was warm and amber, and outside the January wind moved through the cedars with a sound like breathing. "I hadn't thought of it that way," he said. She looked back at the portrait, at the laughing woman with the warm brown eyes. "She looks like someone who would not want you to be carrying this alone forever." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, so quietly she almost did not hear it, "No. She wouldn't." February came in cold but beginning to show, far at the edges, the first intimations of spring, the way the light changed by imperceptible degrees, and the cedar waxwings gathered in the juniper trees, and the days stretched out by minutes. Pablo's wrist healed enough for light work, and his spirit, which had been subdued by weeks of enforced rest, recovered with the speed of youth, and the bunkhouse became lively again in the evenings, and Ernesto was visibly relieved to have conversation that was not confined to one room. Luke had begun to come to the porch in the evenings after supper rather than going directly to the main room, and Matilda had begun, on mild evenings, to sit on the porch as well, and they had developed the habit of sitting side by side in the 2 rocking chairs and talking or not talking as the mood took them, looking out over the land as it darkened, and the stars came up one by one. One evening he told her about how he had come to build the house, the specific decisions he had made and why, which stones he had chosen for the fireplace, because Clara had wanted a fireplace you could stand inside of, and how the main room window was set at exactly the right height to catch the western light, because he had tested it with a mirror at different heights, until he found the angle that made the afternoon light come in like something solid and gold. She listened to all of it and then she said, "You built this house like a love letter." He turned to look at her on the porch in the February dusk, and something in her face, some quality of it, the attention and the understanding and the green eyes that took nothing for granted, reached him in a place that had been shut for 3 years. "I suppose I did," he said. "It shows," she said, "in the best possible way." He looked at her, and the words that came were simpler than all the complicated ones he had been arranging and rearranging in his mind for weeks. "Matilda," he said, "I would like to take you to supper in town on Saturday, not as your employer." As he paused, and a rare color came into his face which she found unexpectedly charming. "I think you know what I mean." She did know, and she felt the warmth of it spread from her chest outward in every direction like the first proper warmth of spring after a long cold winter. "I would like that," she said, and her voice was steady and her heart was absolutely not, and both of those things were entirely right. They went to the hotel dining room in Redemption Creek on Saturday evening, which was the finest restaurant in town by default and by merit, run by a German couple named Hartman, who had come west from San Antonio in 1870, and proceeded to make the best food within 50 miles and know it. Luke wore his good coat and Matilda wore the blue dress she had brought in the bottom of the battered carpet bag, the only truly fine thing she had carried away from Brenham, a dress that had been her mother's and that she had altered to fit herself. And the blue of it against the October brown of her complexion made Luke, when he saw her come down the hall from the spare bedroom toward the front door, stop entirely for a moment. She saw him stop and raised one eyebrow. "You look beautiful," he said, and it was the simplest and most direct thing he had said to her, and it landed with the weight of its simplicity. She pressed her lips together against a smile that wanted to be too large. "Thank you, you look very well yourself." They drove to town in the wagon, which he had cleaned and fitted with a proper seat cushion, and they ate at the Hartman's best table by the window, and she ordered the roasted chicken, and he ordered the beef, and they ate and talked for 2 hours. And the conversation was different from their porch conversations in a way that was thrilling and slightly terrifying, more deliberate, more careful with its implications. Two people who have decided to see each other clearly and clearly be seen. She told him things she had not told him yet, about what her life in Brenham had been after her mother died, the grinding smallness of it, the way her father had absorbed all of her effort and given back nothing, the way she had begun, over the past year, to understand that she was running out of time to build something that was her own. He listened to all of it without the awkwardness that some men showed when a woman spoke of her difficulties, without the impulse to minimize or fix, just the listening, the full and attentive presence that she had come to recognize as one of his specific and particular qualities. He told her things too, things he had not said aloud since Clara died, about the way the first year after her death he had barely functioned, getting the work done because the cattle required it but doing nothing beyond that, not writing letters, not going to town beyond necessity, not doing anything that was not strictly required. He told her about the moment, about 6 months in, when Ernesto had found him sitting in the barn at midnight and had not asked any questions but had simply sat down next to him and stayed there for 2 hours without speaking, and that had been one of the kindest things anyone had done for him. She listened and her eyes were bright in the lamplight of the dining room, and she said, "Ernesto is a good man." "The best kind," Luke agreed. They drove home under the February stars, and the night was cold and clear, and she sat close to him on the wagon seat, not because the cold required it exactly, but because neither of them moved away, and the warmth of her beside him was something he had been aware of for months and was now permitting himself to fully feel. At the gate of the Double W he stopped the wagon and turned to her, and the words arranged themselves with unexpected simplicity. "I have not felt," he stopped, tried again. "I thought for a long time that what I had with Clara was all I was going to have, not as a decision, just as a fact, and I have been." He looked at her in the dark, the February moonlight on her face, the loose strand of wheat-colored hair at her cheek. "You have changed things, Matilda, without trying. And I find that he stopped again, because the feelings were ahead of the words, running out ahead of them into territory he had not been in for years. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, a gesture of such direct and uncomplicated tenderness that it stopped him entirely. Her palm was warm against the cold of his cheek, and her green eyes were steady in the moonlight. "I know," she said. "I feel it too." He covered her hand with his and held it there for a moment, and then he turned his head slightly and pressed his lips to her palm, and she drew a breath that was not quite steady, and the night around them was vast and still and full of stars. That was the beginning of the part of the story that required no telling, because the heart knows its own language, and it does not require translation. March came in with the first real warmth, and the hill country responded to it with the extravagance it was known for, the bluebonnets coming up on the roadside and the creek banks in sheets of color that went from pale lavender to deep indigo, and the Indian paintbrush mixing through them in orange and red, and the sky going that particular bright blue that seems to be the sky's own answer to the flowers. The land was alive, and the cattle were moving in the lower pastures, and the kitchen garden that Matilda had been tending all winter began to show the first real green shoots of the season. Luke and Matilda had settled into a new arrangement that was not yet anything official, but was understood by everyone on the Double W, and by the town of Redemption Creek with the speed at which small towns absorb such information. They took supper together after Ernesto and Pablo were done, some evenings, just the two of them at the long table with the lamp between them, and on Sundays she drove to church with him rather than staying behind with the housework as she had done through the winter, and these two facts were sufficient for Redemption Creek to draw its conclusions. He had begun, without planning it, to let her into the decision-making of the ranch, not from any formal arrangement, but because her perspective was sharp and practical, and he had come to rely on it. She sat with the account books with him in the evenings, and her comments on where money was being spent and where it could be saved without sacrificing quality were consistently good, and he told her so, and she told him that she had kept her father's business accounts for 6 years and had become competent at it without any help from him. "You could have run his mill," Luke said. "I know," she said, without vanity, just the plain statement of fact. He did not know it because he could not see it. Some people cannot see what is right in front of them. Luke looked at her across the table, and he thought that he himself had spent the last 3 years not quite seeing what was right in front of him, and he was grateful for whatever combination of courage and desperation had sent her walking up his drive with a broken carpetbag and 14 cents, because he could not see how he would have found his way to this place by any other road. In the second week of March, he found her in the kitchen garden one morning in the early light, on her knees in the turned earth, planting seeds from papers she had ordered through the mercantile, and she was talking to herself or to the seeds as she planted, low and continuous, not quite sentences, the kind of murmuring that some people do when they are absorbed in content. And he stood in the doorway of the house and watched her, and the morning light was on her, and the bluebonnets were blooming at the far fence, and everything about the scene was so precise and so right that it hit him in the chest like a bell. He went inside and stood in the main room in front of the fireplace and looked up at the portrait. Clara's laughing eyes looked back at him, and what he felt, standing there in the morning light with the sound of Matilda's voice drifting in faintly from the garden, was not guilt. That was what surprised him. It was not guilt at all. It was something that felt more like gratitude and more like love, the love that does not end with the person but continues, changes shape, finds new forms. He reached up and lifted the portrait from its hook. It was heavier than he expected, or perhaps it was simply that he had not touched it in 3 years. He held it in his hands for a moment, the laughing woman in the blue dress, and he said softly, "Thank you, Clara, for all of it, for every year of it." He carried it to the bedroom and set it on the shelf above the window where the morning light would find it, and when he came back out to the main room, the wall above the fireplace was bare and lighter than the surrounding plaster where the portrait had blocked the years of smoke and lamplight, and the room looked different, open in a way that it had not been. He heard the back door and her footsteps in the kitchen, and then she came to the doorway of the main room, dusting the garden earth from her hands, and saw him standing in front of the fireplace. Her eyes went to the wall above it, to the pale rectangle where the portrait had been, and she went very still. He turned to look at her, and what he felt was completely clear to him. The love of what had been and the love of what was beginning, both held without loss or contradiction, two things that were not in competition but were in fact the same continuity. "I put her in the bedroom," he said. "On the shelf by the window. She'll have more light there." Matilda looked at the bare wall and then at him, and her eyes were bright with something she was managing carefully. "That is a good place for her," she said. He crossed the room to her, which did not take many steps because the room was not large, and he stood in front of her and said, "Matilda Thatcher, I have been in love with you for some time, and I have been too much of a coward to say it plainly." She looked up at him with those direct green eyes that had never yet flinched from anything. "You are not a coward," she said. "You were careful, there's a difference." "Then I am carefully and completely in love with you," he said. "And I would like to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly and not out of gratitude or circumstance or anything else but what you actually feel." "I always answer honestly," she said, which was true and which he knew. "Will you marry me?" he said. She did not answer immediately, and he had a moment of something like vertigo, and then she put her hands against his chest and looked at him with an expression that was the warmest thing he had ever seen and said, "I have been in love with you since November, Luke Wells. I would be honored to marry you." He kissed her, which was both a beginning and a kind of return to something, the warmth of another person, the solid fact of connection. And outside the March wind moved through the bluebonnets, and the hill country sky was so blue it ached. They married in May, at the church in Redemption Creek, on a Saturday morning with the windows open and the spring air coming through, and the congregation of 314 souls filling the pews and spilling out the door. The pastor who performed the service was a tall, thin man named Reverend Crane, who had been in Redemption Creek for 15 years and who had known Luke and Clara, and who performed the ceremony with a gravity that honored both the past and the present, which was exactly right. Matilda wore her mother's blue dress, altered again for the occasion, with a spray of bluebonnets pinned at her shoulder because the choice seemed right, the wild flowers of the country where she had found her life. Luke wore his good coat, and a new shirt that Ernesto had pressed with the iron that morning, while Pablo watched and offered opinions on whether the collar was straight. When she came down the aisle on the arm of Mrs. Hartman from the hotel, who had appointed herself to the role because someone needed to fill it, and the German woman had decided that someone was her, Luke watched her come and thought that he was the luckiest man in the state of Texas, and possibly in the broader continental United States. When the pastor said, "You may kiss your bride," Luke kissed her, and the congregation made the sounds congregations make at such moments. And Ernesto, sitting in the front pew with his wife Maria and their 3 children who had come from Careville for the occasion, made no sound at all but simply smiled in the way of a man who has seen something he was waiting for finally arrive. Pablo, 19 months younger than anyone's patience with him, said, "Finally," quite clearly, and was shushed by everyone in his immediate vicinity. The reception was held in the Grange Hall, as these things were, with food brought by half the town and the fiddler who played at the Saturday dances coming to play for 2 hours, and Matilda danced with Luke for the first time, which they had not done before, and he was better at it than she expected, and she told him so. And he said that Clara had insisted on teaching him, and she smiled at that Clara's skill was still moving forward in the world through the man who had loved her. And she thought this was how love really worked, how it extended itself through time. The months that followed were the months of building something new, which was different from the work of repair, different from the daily management of an existing thing. It was the particular work of two people learning to share a life, with all the adjustments and negotiations and discoveries that implied. She learned that he woke earlier than her, before the sun, and spent the first hour of the day in a silence that was not unwelcoming but was his, and she respected it by making the first pot of coffee and leaving his cup on the porch rail and not talking to him until the sky started to lighten. He learned that she had strong opinions about the arrangement of the kitchen that were not up for discussion, and that she sang when she was very happy and went quiet when she was troubled, and that the thing to do when she was quiet was to sit nearby and wait rather than press her. She learned that he was generous in ways that were practical, that he fixed the stuck window without being asked, and brought her wildflowers on occasions that did not require them, just because he had seen them on the fence line and thought of her. He learned that she cried at things she would rather not cry at, and handled it with dignity and slight irritation at herself, and that the best response was to put a hand on her back and say nothing until she was done. They argued sometimes, because two strong-willed people in a small house will, about things that seemed to matter considerably in the moment and seemed less significant by evening, and they learned each other's edges and how to navigate them with something approaching grace. In the summer, Jonas Thatcher sent a letter, his second attempt at contact, formal and brief, indicating that he was in declining health and that he hoped she might consider visiting. Luke read it with her because she asked him to, and when she was done she was quiet for a while and then she said, "He is my father. He is a difficult man and he has done me real harm, but he is my father." "What do you want to do?" Luke asked. "I want to write him back," she said. "I am not ready to see him, but I can write." She wrote a careful letter that was honest without being cruel, that told him she was well and happy and that she wished him improved health. She did not promise to visit. She did not extend forgiveness as a formal thing, because forgiveness of that kind is a process, not an event, and she was smart enough to know the difference. "That took courage," Luke said when she had sealed it. "It took practice," she said. "My mother taught me that dignity is not the same as coldness." Summer turned to fall and the 2nd October arrived, and the hill country went bronze and gold, and the light changed back to that hard particular blue, and Matilda told Luke on an October evening, sitting on the porch in the rocking chairs, that she was expecting a child. He looked at her for a long moment and she could not quite read his expression, and then he reached across and took her hand carefully as though it were something precious, and he said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "Very well," she said. "A little tired, Mrs. Hartman says that passes." He held her hand and looked out at the land in the October light, and she could see him adjusting to the new information the way a good man adjusts to enormous things, slowly and with intention. Then he looked at her, and his eyes were bright with something that he did not try to hide. "I am so glad," he said. "I am so—" He stopped because the emotion was ahead of the words, but she understood. "So am I," she said, and squeezed his hand. The news traveled through the Double W and the town of Redemption Creek with the speed of all such news. Ernesto shook Luke's hand with both of his, and his eyes were warm. Pablo threw his hat in the air and caught it, which was his standard response to good news of any magnitude. Mrs. Hartman came by with a pie and a volume of practical advice that lasted an hour and a half. The pastor said a prayer of thanksgiving. Luke built a cradle, slowly and carefully over 3 months, in the evenings after supper, working in the barn with the good lamp and the woodworking tools that he had not used in years. Matilda watched him work at it sometimes, standing in the barn doorway, and the sight of him bent over the cradle in the lamplight, the concentration and the care of it, was one of the things she stored away in the part of her memory reserved for the things she wanted to keep. She hung a small painting she had made herself on the wall of the room that would be the nursery, and she planted lavender along the path from the house to the garden because lavender smelled like calm, and she wanted their child to grow up surrounded by calm things. Luke put a new lock on the gate, a better one, because the old one had been loose for a year and now seemed worth fixing. The baby was born in June in the upstairs room of the house, with the help of Mrs. Calloway, the midwife from town, and Matilda's friend by this time, Mrs. Ernesto Morales, who had become in the past year something like an older sister, and whose presence through the long hours of labor was a steady and practical comfort. The baby was a boy. Luke was in the main room when the baby cried for the first time, and he closed his eyes, and the gratitude he felt was so large he could not find the edges of it. When Mrs. Calloway brought him in to meet his son, he found Matilda propped up in the bed looking exhausted and radiant in equal measure, and he sat beside her and held the baby, who was red and new and completely furious with the world he had just arrived in, and Luke said, "Hello," in a voice that was not quite steady, and the baby, as though recognizing the voice from somewhere, stopped crying for a moment. "He is stubborn," Matilda said fondly. "Wonder where he gets that," Luke said, and she made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an exhausted sigh. They named the boy Henry, for no specific person but for the sound of it, which was solid and did not pretend to be more than it was. Henry Wells of the Double W Ranch, who had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and an opinion about absolutely everything from his first week of life. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because the land was not always kind, and the cattle market rose and fell with the rhythms of a national economy that had not yet fully recovered from the war, and the Texas frontier was still, in those years, a place of genuine uncertainty, where drought and disease and the hard arithmetic of ranching could undo a year's work in a month. Luke and Matilda faced these things as they came together, which was the operative word that made the difference. She continued to manage the household accounts and extended her role gradually to include the ranch finances, and Luke said to Ernesto one evening that he had been managing money badly for years and hadn't known it, and Ernesto said that he had known it but had not been certain how to raise the subject, and Luke said, "You could have said something," and Ernesto said, "Some things you have to wait for the right person to say," and looked at him with the expression of a man who is making a specific point. And Luke understood. When Henry was 2 years old, he could already distinguish between different kinds of cattle and had strong views about which horses were good and which were not, and could frequently be found in the kitchen garden with his mother, either helping or obstructing, according to his mood. He was a sunny, determined, difficult child who was adored by everyone on the ranch, and who regarded his parents with the absolute confidence of a person who has never had reason to doubt the ground beneath his feet. And that confidence was the thing they had given him that neither of them had been given themselves, and they knew its value. When Henry was 3, Matilda told Luke on another October evening that there would be a second child, and this time she could read his expression without difficulty, because it was exactly what it was, uncomplicated and complete joy. The second child was a girl, born in the spring when the bluebonnets were out along the fence lines, and the hill country was doing what it did in April, which was to be so extravagantly beautiful that it seemed almost unfair. They named her Clara, which was not something they had planned but which arrived as right and complete when Luke said it quietly the first time he held her, and Matilda looked at the baby and then at him and said, "Yes." Clara, without hesitation, and it was a carrying forward rather than a holding back, the name coming into the future with them. The portrait of the first Clara Wells stayed on the shelf in the bedroom, where the morning light found it. Henry, when he was old enough to ask questions, asked who the woman in the picture was, and Luke told him that she was a very important person who had been part of this family before Henry arrived, and Henry accepted this with the pragmatic openness of early childhood and went back to his more pressing concerns, which at that time involved a particularly interesting beetle he was attempting to maintain in a box. Young Clara, when she was old enough to notice the portrait, would sometimes look at it with a focused attention that her mother recognized as her own look, concentrated and direct, as though she was working something out. One morning when she was 4 years old, she looked at the portrait and then at her father and said, "She was happy," and Luke said, Yes, she was. And Clara nodded as though this settled something and went to find her brother. The double W grew in those years, not recklessly but carefully, as Luke had always done things, adding acreage when the opportunity and finances aligned, improving the breeding stock, building a second barn. Ernesto remained, his children growing up between Careville and Redemption Creek, and Pablo stayed as well, and eventually brought home a wife from San Antonio named Rosa, who was small and quick and gave as good as she got, and immediately found in Matilda an ally and a friend. The town of Redemption Creek grew too, the railroad coming through in 1876 and changing the arithmetic of the cattle market and the speed at which the world moved. And Matilda adapted to this, and to every other change with the pragmatic intelligence of someone who had learned early that the world moved whether you moved with it or not, and that moving with it was the better strategy. Luke, for his part, became over those years exactly the man he had the materials to be, but had needed the right circumstances to fully become. The grief was always a part of him, as true grief always is, but it was integrated now, one thread in a many-threaded life rather than the whole cloth. He was known in Redemption Creek as a man of exceptional integrity and considerable warmth, though the warmth had taken years to be fully visible, and he was one of those men whose goodness people feel without always being able to specify exactly why. On an October evening when Henry was 5 and young Clara was 2, and the hill country was dressed in its autumn colors, Luke and Matilda sat on the porch in the rocking chairs as they had sat from the beginning, the same chairs in the same places, and the children were asleep in the house behind them, and the stars were coming up in the usual extravagant quantity, and the cedar smell was in the cool air. "Do you remember October 3 years ago?" she said. "2 years and a few months before that," he said. "When you walked up my drive with that carpetbag. I was terrified," she said. He turned to look at her. "You did not look it. That was the point," she said and smiled. He reached over and took her hand as he did on these evenings, the simple, habitual warmth of it. "What did you think when you first saw the place?" she considered. "I thought it was beautiful and that whoever had built it had loved it, and I thought," she paused, "I thought the house needed something, not cleaning or repair exactly. It needed," she found the word, "continuation." He was quiet, looking at the dark land and the rising stars. "And then you walked in and made bread and the whole thing changed." "Bread is a powerful thing," she said. "It is," he agreed. Inside the house one of the children made a small sleeping sound and then was quiet, and the night settled back into its deep hill country silence, the kind that is not empty but full, and the two of them sat in it with the ease of people who have built something together that they both belong to, that belongs to them both, that is solid and warm and real. The portrait was on the shelf in the bedroom, in the morning light. The main room wall had a watercolor painting over the fireplace now, of the view from the hill behind the house where Clara had stood 20-some years ago and said, "This is it." Matilda had painted it herself, quietly, over a winter, working from a sketch she had made in the mornings, and had hung it without ceremony on an April morning, and Luke had stood in front of it for a long time and then turned and held her, and nothing needed to be said. The double W ran on into the years of the 1870s, and toward the 1880s, the land and the cattle and the family growing together with the slow, determined vitality of things that are well-rooted. Henry grew into a boy who loved horses above everything, and showed a talent for working with them that Pablo declared, with uncharacteristic seriousness, was genuinely exceptional. Young Clara grew into a girl who was like her mother in ways that made Luke catch his breath sometimes, the directness and the attention and the stubbornness deployed in service of things worth being stubborn about. Matilda, at 31, was a woman who had built something of her own from almost nothing, who had walked 4 days with 14 cents and a broken carpetbag, and found a life waiting at the end of the road, and she knew the value of what she had because she had arrived at it entirely without help and had built it with her own hands. Luke, at 37, was a man who had survived the unsurvivable and come out the other side not diminished but deepened, and who had learned, eventually, that keeping faith with the dead does not require sealing yourself off from the living, and that the heart's capacity is not a finite quantity that gets used up, but something more like good land, which, properly tended, produces more rather than less over time. He had not removed his late wife's portrait until the morning she walked onto his land, and he had known, standing in the main room with the bare wall above the fireplace, that the removal was not an ending but a continuation. That love was like the ranch itself, built on what came before, owing everything to it, and moving forward into what would come next. On the last evening of October, which was by this point 5 years from the morning she had come up his drive, they sat on the porch as the last of the day's light died beyond the cedar ridges to the west, and Henry was inside protesting his bedtime with the considerable energy of a 5-year-old boy, and young Clara was already asleep, and the stars were coming up, and Matilda looked at the great dark spread of the hill country under the sky and felt the particular, unflashy, bone-deep contentment of a person who has exactly what they most need and knows it. "Luke," she said. "Matilda," he said, "I'm going to tell you something and I want you to receive it simply and without a great deal of fuss." He turned to look at her, and in the last of the light she could see the ease in his face, the ease that had come back to him over years, the ease of a man at home in his own life. "I love this place," she said, "and I love the man who built it, and I am grateful every single day for a broken carpetbag and 14 cents. He was quiet for a moment, holding her hand, looking at the stars coming up over the land that had been worked and loved and built on, that would go on after them through their children and their children's children, the way everything good goes on if you plan it carefully and tend it true. "I am grateful," he said, "for a woman stubborn enough to walk 4 days to find a better life." She smiled at the stars. "It was not stubbornness, it was conviction. In your case," he said, "they are the same thing." She laughed, and the sound of it moved through the October dark, and he thought that it was the sound of the house being fully alive, of all of it, the years behind and the years ahead, gathered into one moment on a porch in the Texas hill country, and he held her hand and let the gratitude be as large as it was, which was very large indeed. Inside, Henry had given up his protest and gone quiet, and young Clara slept on, and the fire Pablo had built in the main room before heading to the bunkhouse sent its light out through the window, and the portrait on the bedroom shelf was in darkness now, the laughing woman at rest in the house she had helped to build, part of everything that had come after her, present in the man her husband had become and the life he had made, woven into the fabric of the double W as surely as the limestone walls and the cedar timbers and the kitchen garden coming up green in the morning. The night held them. The stars were magnificent. The land ran away in every direction into the dark, and it was theirs, and they were its, and everything that mattered was exactly where it should be.